Number 9. Canadian woman meets icy lake. A 23-year-old Canadian woman was driving on a dark, foggy night in Tobermory, Ontario in May 2016 when her GPS reportedly led her straight into a part of Lake Huron known as Georgian Bay. According to provincial police, visibility was poor when the confused motorist approached a boat launch on Little Tub Harbor at around midnight and made a wrong turn, causing her to plunge into the frigid lake. Thankfully, though, the driver was able to roll her window down and escape the vehicle. She even had time to grab her purse before swimming about 100 feet to shore and walking to a nearby hotel where she called the police. Her Toyota Yaris was then removed from the water the next morning. The woman wasn't only lucky to be alive, she was extremely fortunate that she didn't suffer serious injuries or hypothermia, especially since the water temperature was just a handful of degrees above freezing at 39.2 degrees Fahrenheit that night. She was, however, slightly embarrassed and declined to speak with the media, instead relying on police to relay information about the incident. A law enforcement spokesperson made it clear that alcohol didn't play a role in the woman's unplanned swim, and she wasn't charged with any crimes. Number 8. History repeats itself at Hawaiian Harbor. A Hawaiian vacation took a terrifying turn for a pair of tourists visiting the Big Island in May of 2023 when they accidentally drove their Dodge Caravan into Honokohau small boat harbor in Kailua Kona. Witnesses described seeing water flooding in through the van's open windows as its two occupants sat with their seatbelts secured. The passenger managed to escape, but the driver had to be extracted from the vehicle and carried up the boat ramp by Good Samaritans. According to bystanders, the vacationers were on their way to a manta ray excursion when they misunderstood the directions from their GPS. A similar incident occurred just a month later when another tourist accidentally drove her car into the very same harbor. She told police that her GPS instructed her to take a turn, which led her down the boat ramp and into the water. The motorist further explained that when she saw a body of water on the GPS screen, she thought it was just a big puddle, only to discover that she'd landed herself in deep water. Bystanders reported that the woman reacted surprisingly slowly to the situation and that she grabbed her belongings and escaped the vehicle just in time to avoid ending up in a potentially deadly predicament. She was rescued by a civilian in a nearby boat, and the car was eventually removed from the water. Number 7. Ankle monitors failed to stop serial killers. 27-year-old Frank Cano and 45-year-old Stephen Dean Gordon were both wearing ankle monitors when they committed a multitude of horrifying crimes together in Orange County, California in 2013. Just a year earlier, the two transients had both cut off their devices and fled the state together. But they were captured in Las Vegas 2 weeks later and were eventually released on parole, and as a result, they were once again required to wear ankle bracelets. It was during this time that the men went from being convicted offenders with violent criminal histories to being serial killers as they brutally attacked and murdered at least 4 female prostitutes over a several-month period. They were wearing their ankle monitors the entire time while keeping up with their required check-ins with police every 30 days. They even managed to evade suspicion for their killing spree until the body of 21-year-old Jarrell Nicole Estep appeared on a conveyor belt at a garbage sorting plant in Anaheim in early 2014. The discovery of Estep's body led investigators to take a closer look at the missing persons cases of 20-year-old Kiana Jackson, 34-year-old Josephine Monique Vargas, and 28-year-old Martha Anaya, who all disappeared under similar circumstances. Their bodies were never found, but authorities obtained enough evidence to pursue charges against Cano and Gordon in connection with all 4 deaths. The movements of the men's GPS trackers helped to solidify the cases against them, although many people were left wondering why more attention wasn't paid to their whereabouts during their months-long murder spree. Gordon was found guilty of the killings in 2016 and was sentenced to death the following year, but he'll most likely serve life in prison due to ongoing suspensions of executions in California. Cano pleaded guilty to all 4 murders and received an automatic life sentence without parole. Number 6. 12-foot bus drives into 9-foot bridge. A bus driver was transporting a high school girls' softball team in Seattle one day in April 2008 when he accidentally drove the 12-foot vehicle into a footbridge with a 9-foot clearance. As you can likely imagine, the vehicle didn't fit beneath the brick and concrete structure, causing considerable damage to the bus and sending 21 passengers to the hospital. The driver was using a GPS navigation system that had settings for driving a car, motorcycle, bus, or truck. It was programmed to use the bus option, but for some reason, it guided the driver under the bridge. The GPS couldn't be blamed entirely, though. There were reportedly plenty of flashing lights, along with a bright yellow sign warning drivers of the bridge's height. But the driver somehow managed to miss these warning mechanisms that were in place to prevent the exact type of accident that occurred that day. According to experts at the time, some GPS systems calculated routes for large vehicles based on general information, including roadways that were closed to buses, without factoring in more specific information like bridge heights. Speaking with Seattle PI, Garmin spokesperson Ted Gartner compared avoiding a low bridge clearing to following traffic lights. In other words, the structure is there and drivers were expected to follow the law and act accordingly. Luckily, technology has come a long way since then, making incidents like this far less likely than they were in the past. Number 5. Tourists from Tokyo drive into the ocean. An astounding number of drivers end up driving into bodies of water because they trust their GPS more than their eyesight. Such was the case among 3 20-something Japanese tourists in Australia named Yuzu Noda, Tamanari Saika, and Kita Osada, whose rental car ended up in the Pacific Ocean during an attempted drive to North Stradbroke Island off Brisbane. The trio hoped to enjoy a day trip to the island, but their plans were put on hold when they followed instructions from their GPS to drive straight through 50 yards. After driving about 150 feet into the water, the vacationers realized that there was no way they could continue. They tried to turn around, but were unable to do so due to the incoming tide, leaving them with no choice but to abandon the car. Within a short amount of time, the vehicle was submerged in about 6.5 feet of water. The car was insured, but the tourists still had to pay roughly $1,500 in extra damage costs. It's possible that the visitors thought the bay looked passable because they first approached at low tide, but it's still hard to imagine how they concluded that it was a logical idea in the first place. Yuzu Noda nevertheless defended the decision, telling the Evening Post that the GPS told us we could drive there. Number 4. Hopelessly lost in the desert. What was supposed to be a fun outing became a sheer nightmare for a group of 26 tourists from California in 2008 when their GPS route stranded them at the edge of a cliff deep inside Utah's Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. The vacationers were following a route from Bryce Canyon National Park to the Grand Canyon in several vehicles when they encountered unexpectedly rough roads. And to make matters even worse, it was a moonless night, which only served to further obscure visibility. At least one vehicle got stuck in soft ground, while 2 others nearly ran out of gas. Meanwhile, the GPS continuously led the caravan down dirt roads that ended at the edges of cliffs. The travelers became so lost and confused that they eventually began to panic. They made it back to safety, though, after being located by law enforcement and after being stranded in their vehicles overnight, an experience that one group member named Daniel Cohen described to the Associated Press as a vacation from hell. Chief Deputy Tracy Glover told the AP that the ordeal began with one wrong turn, which led to another wrong turn, and then another, and so on and so forth. The road conditions progressively worsened as they diverted further from the correct route, eventually landing them on a series of dirt roads that are difficult to traverse, even in the most ideal weather conditions. Glover said that she didn't understand why people often continue driving in situations when they should clearly turn around, stating, "The shortest way is not always the quickest way, but it apparently happens somewhat often, and GPS is known to frequently play a role in these mishaps, with dozens of people becoming lost over a 12-year period since the monument's opening in 1996 and the stranding of the tourist caravan in 2008. Number 3. Drivers ending up on train tracks. British railroad workers flagged down police one night in 2009 after a motorist named Satleh Mohammadi drove his Ford Fiesta along the train tracks of a busy commuter line spanning from Doncaster to Hull. Mohammadi had traveled roughly 20 feet down the railway line shortly after midnight and he blamed his erroneous driving on his GPS, claiming that it had instructed him to turn onto the tracks. But it wasn't entirely the GPS's fault, according to police, who said that Mohammadi's blood alcohol content tested at just below the legal limits at the scene. As a result, he was banned from driving for 20 months and was given a 12-month community order, which meant that he'd avoid a conviction as long as he followed certain rules and conditions that were set forth by the court. Accidentally driving onto railroad tracks can easily get someone killed. An 18-year-old delivery driver from Indiana was lucky to be alive after he ended up driving along a railway in 2022. He'd later claimed that his GPS had instructed him to turn onto the tracks. His car got stuck in the path of an oncoming train, but he was luckily able to escape before the train smashed into the vehicle. The car wasn't drivable afterward, but the train only suffered minimal damage and was able to carry on along its route. In a similar ordeal that occurred 14 years earlier in 2008, a Silicon Valley man obediently turned right onto some Metro North train tracks in Bedford Hills, New York, because his GPS told him to. The device was actually instructing the driver to turn several yards ahead, but he failed to realize this, and his vehicle's undercarriage got stuck on the rails. He grabbed his belongings, got out of the car, and dialed 911 while trying to warn an oncoming train about the situation at hand by waving his arms in the air. But the train was unable to stop in time to avoid hitting the car, and the vehicle erupted into flames after being dragged some 100 feet along the tracks. Nobody was seriously hurt, but the train and its 500 passengers were delayed for several hours, along with at least 10 other trains, making the misguided driver the most hated person in New York that day. Number 2. Misguided walker sues Google Maps. In case you haven't noticed, GPS systems often yield much different directions for walkers versus drivers, since pedestrians can often go places where cars can't, and vice versa. A Utah woman named Lauren Rosenberg learned this lesson the hard way in 2009 when Google Maps sent her walking along a busy 4-lane highway with no sidewalks in Park City at nighttime. She was struck and seriously injured by a vehicle being driven by a man named Patrick Harwood. According to a lawsuit Rosenberg filed against Harwood and Google, her medical bills totaled over $100,000. She essentially accused Google Maps of almost getting her killed by leading her into an area with no designated pedestrian walking space, while alleging that Harwood was driving negligently when he hit her. The court ultimately determined that Rosenberg lacked a valid claim against Google because she and the company didn't have a direct legal relationship with one another. Furthermore, the court concluded that Google Maps offers services of considerable value to the public, and that allowing the suit to move forward would open a potential floodgate of nearly unlimited liability for the company. And now for number 1. But if you want to hear more bizarre and crazy stories, stay tuned after the video for some more content. Number 1. GPS leads driver up goat trail. 37-year-old Robert Ziegler blindly trusted his GPS while driving in Bergen, Switzerland one day in 2010, causing him to turn onto a path that looked more like a hiking trail than an actual road. He quickly realized that something was wrong, but he just kept on going, hoping that he'd eventually end up back on the main road. But as it turned out, Ziegler had turned along a goat trail. It wasn't suitable for motor vehicles, especially not for the van that he was driving, and he became so hopelessly stuck that by the time he called for help, the only way to rescue him from his predicament was to move the van using a heavy lifting helicopter. Bystanders reportedly told the press that the trail was clearly marked as a pedestrian path and that it was well known in the region, but there were other obvious signs that should have told Ziegler to back out while he still could, including the fact that the trail led up a steep mountain. On the other hand, a fire brigade spokesperson reportedly admitted that he must have been a decent enough driver to have made it as far up the trail as he did before he called for help. Apparently, it all depends on how you look at the situation.
8. Kirsty Bar. In 2018, Kirsty Bar allegedly left her infant daughter on the baby's father's doorstep in Hull, England. His family reported the incident to social services, and from then on, Bar was on a seemingly non-stop mission to ruin her ex-boyfriend's life, starting with a series of threatening phone calls. Bar also put the victim in jail twice, with a series of false claims that he'd attacked and threatened her. At one point, he was arrested 10 times in a month. On another occasion, law enforcement performed an armed raid on his home at 2 in the morning with a helicopter hovering overhead, leaving his family absolutely traumatized. The case ruined the man's life in every way imaginable. He lost his job, was left with a criminal record, was portrayed as a monster by the media, began having health problems from the stress of the situation, and at one point fled the area in an effort to prove that he wasn't doing the things Bar accused him of. The man hit such a low point that he no longer wanted to live. But he continued to maintain his innocence, and after years of fighting, the court determined that he had been falsely convicted based on Bar's lies and that she was the real perpetrator. Authorities arrested Bar, and finally she was the one defending herself in court. She was convicted of perverting the course of justice and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. 7. Vanessahakaba. Shortly after she started dating a new man in 2020, a woman from Key West received a barrage of harassing text messages that she suspected were from his ex, Vanessa Marie Hakaba. She blocked the number, but the threatening and insulting messages continued to come from other numbers. The perpetrator taunted the victim, stating that if she thought text messages were bad, her home and her job would soon come next. Then someone posed as the victim on a sugar daddy dating website, using her photos and disclosing her phone number and address. The culprit used the profile, which featured the headline "Fresh Meth Tonight," to invite men over to the victim's house for intimate encounters. Soon enough, strangers began showing up at her residence. Hakaba was taken into custody on suspicion of cyberstalking and harassment, and had to answer in the court of law for allegedly tormenting her romantic rival. 6. Goar. What started out as a casual fling between Dave Krupa and Carrie Farver quickly gained the potential to become serious. Just weeks after meeting, Carrie was staying at Dave's apartment in Omaha, Nebraska for days at a time. One day she sent Dave a text message asking if they could move in together. He wasn't ready to take that step, so he said no. Carrie responded with a slew of insulting texts, and Dave never saw her again. In fact, nobody did. She went missing, but remained active on social media, initially leading police to believe she vanished voluntarily. Meanwhile, Dave and his ex-girlfriend, Shanna Goar, were bombarded with threatening emails and text messages that they continued to receive for 3 years. The culprit also stalked the pair, often watching Dave from outside his apartment, and burned Liz's house down. Dave and Liz repeatedly reported the harassment to police and became close again as a result of their shared suffering. But when authorities finally began to investigate the matter in 2015, they quickly discovered that the threatening correspondence from Carrie was actually coming from Liz's phone and computer. They also found Liz's DNA in Carrie's abandoned car and photos of Carrie's decomposing body on Liz's computer. Around the same time, Dave moved out of the area to be closer to his kids and their mother, Amy Flora. Not long after that, Liz dialed 911. Someone had shot her in the leg, and she seemed intent on convincing the police that Flora was the culprit. But detectives quickly ruled Flora out as a suspect, and by then the pattern was clear. Liz terrorized the women in David's life in a jealous rage and framed them for harassment and other bogus crimes, including the gunshot wound to her leg, which turned out to be self-inflicted. Police also concluded that she probably burned down her own house. Carrie's remains were never found, but the case was strong enough for the jury to convict Liz of murder. She continues to maintain her innocence from behind bars while serving a life sentence without parole. 5. Chuck and Martha and Kagmarshik. While receiving inpatient treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, Robert McClancy met fellow Vietnam veteran Chuck Kagmarshik. They became best friends and continued to hang out daily after Robert returned to his home in Monroe, Tennessee. He was grateful to have a friend who understood what he'd been through and was unaware that Chuck was a total fraud. Unbeknownst to Robert, his wife Martha was having an affair with his new buddy, and the clandestine couple wanted him out of the picture. They got their wish in 2006, when Robert was found dead from a medication overdose with a gun in his hand. Authorities initially concluded that he took his own life. In the meantime, Chuck and Martha got married and cashed in on Robert's life insurance policy, military pension, and survivor's benefits. But their lives began to unravel when Chuck was called out for exaggerating his military service, which happened around the same time people began to notice that he and Martha had become suspiciously wealthy. While some bought the couple's claims that they had scored high-paying government jobs, investigators uncovered forged documents that Chuck had used to obtain a Purple Heart and other prestigious military awards. They also learned that Martha was attending veterans events claiming to be a retired Marine. Both were fraudulently collecting veterans' disability benefits and were captured on camera being wheeled into the VA for doctor's appointments and walking around perfectly fine at home. The discovery prompted investigators to take a second look at Robert's death, and they uncovered evidence that Martha and Chuck co-conspired to kill him and staged it as a self-inflicted death. And it was planned well ahead of time. In the months leading up to the murder, they'd purposefully over-medicated Robert and taken him to the hospital to create a false history of attempting to take his own life. Martha and Chuck are both serving 25-year sentences and could see freedom again during their lifetime. 4. Chad Wallen Reed. In 2011, Army veteran Chad Wallen Reed spent the 4th of July at his remote cabin in Plumas County, California, with his family and some friends. There was a history of break-ins at the isolated property, so everyone was armed and prepared to defend themselves. Chad had also hung signs around the perimeter, threatening to use deadly force against trespassers. On the first night, the vacationers noticed a car stopped on the road in front of the cabin. Someone stole one of the no trespassing signs and a solar light, and the car drove off. The next night, the same car reappeared. Chad fired a warning shot and the vehicle sped away. He got into his truck and pursued the car in a high-speed chase that lasted for several miles as he repeatedly shot at the rear window. At one point, the people in the vehicle being chased waved a white t-shirt out the window as a surrender flag in hopes that Chad would back off. But he kept chasing and shooting until the car came to a stop. 3 young men ran from the vehicle to get help for 3 others who were shot, one of whom would later die from his injuries. Chad told police that the men had shot at him first. He also claimed to be a former Army Ranger and said that he reacted according to his military training, mentioning how he'd been involved in combat overseas and hinting at the possibility he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. But the men in the car weren't armed and they weren't burglars, but were simply in the area to celebrate the holiday. It was clear, based on the evidence, that they posed no imminent threat and were doing everything in their power to flee. And while Chad may not have set anyone up as part of an elaborate plot, witnesses recalled him saying he was going to get the people in the car as he left the property, yet he immediately switched into victim mode when authorities arrived. Chad was also never a Special Forces Ranger and never fought overseas or killed anyone in combat. He served in the army for a handful of years but was kicked out, ruling out the likelihood that he shot the victims during a PTSD episode. The case sparked a heated debate among the public about whether the shooting was justified, but a jury ultimately convicted Chad of first-degree murder and sentenced him to 50 years to life. 3. Stephen Port. 21-year-old Daniel Whitworth was found dead outside a church in East London in 2014. A note attached to his body contained a confession for the recent death of another young man, Gabriel Cavari. It stated that Whitworth had killed Cavari by accident and was overwhelmed with guilt, and said to please not blame the man he'd been with the night before. Detectives initially assumed Whitworth had taken his own life by purposefully overdosing on a drug called GHB. They didn't compare the handwriting in the note to a sample of Whitworth's handwriting, and they didn't seem too concerned with identifying the man mentioned in the note. That man happened to be Stephen Port, a chef in his 40s who lived near the church where Whitworth was found. Whitworth was just one of 4 men who were found dead near Port's apartment over a 16-month period between 2014 and 2015, and police initially failed to make any connections between the deaths despite numerous similarities. They were also reluctant to provide surveillance footage and images of the suspect, but one family talked them into it and pushed for the photos to be made public. Within 2 days, Port was identified as the suspect. He was found guilty of murdering 4 men, including Whitworth and Kovari, the man Whitworth supposedly confessed to killing in the note. Port met his victims on the Grindr dating app. He lured them into his apartment where he fatally overdosed them with GHB and assaulted them. The court convicted him of murder and he was sentenced to life with no chance of parole. The police justified their investigative shortcomings by claiming that they were inexperienced and overburdened at the time of the murders, but some members of the public have accused law enforcement of failing to take the investigation seriously because they didn't care about getting justice for the victims. Many suspect that Port may be responsible for other unsolved deaths of gay men in the area. 2. Ronald Watts. Over a 10-year period starting in the early 2000s, a team led by former Chicago Police Sergeant Ronald Watts routinely framed innocent civilians at a public housing complex for drug-related crimes. Residents were stopped and shaken down by members of the task force while engaging in everyday tasks like parking their car, walking down hallways, or sitting outside. Those who failed to pay off the cops would later testify that they were falsely accused of drug crimes and in many cases had drugs planted on them by the police. Knowing that there was little chance of the court believing that they were set up, many victims pleaded out to reduce charges to get their cases over with so they could move on with their lives. The scam led to the convictions of hundreds of innocent people and combined prison sentences totaling 274 years. Besides being imprisoned for crimes they didn't commit, victims had their lives ruined in other ways. They lost jobs, weren't able to find decent work with a conviction on their record, lost homes, and in some cases, ended up living on the street. The FBI nabbed Watts and his team in 2012 when an agent posed as a homeless drug dealer as part of a sting. That same year, Watts pleaded guilty to extortion and was sentenced to 22 months in prison. But for many, the effects of his crimes lingered for years as they fought to clear their names and get their lives back on track. To date, more than 220 false convictions have been thrown out, and the remaining cases remain under review. 1. Tom Bledsoe. One day in 1999, Camille Arfman was shot dead at a farm in Oskaloosa, Kansas. Tom Bledsoe, whose family owned the farm, confessed to killing her and led police to her body, which had been thrown under a pile of trash on the property. But he later recanted his confession and pointed the finger at his brother Floyd, who he claimed had threatened to disclose embarrassing secrets from his past if he didn't take the fall. Tom's parents backed his alibi in court, and his testimony helped to secure a conviction against Floyd for murder. Floyd was sentenced to life, but continued fighting to clear his name from behind bars. The Innocence Project took on his case and in 2015 released evidence indicating the DNA at the crime scene most likely belonged to Tom, not Floyd. Just weeks later, Tom took his own life. He left behind a note confessing to the murder and specifically stating that Floyd was innocent. It also contained details about the crime that only the perpetrator would know. After 16 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, Floyd was set free. And while it robbed him of his freedom and the opportunity to watch his kids grow up, he found it in his heart to forgive his family. In a piece he wrote for The Guardian, he explained that the decision to forgive those who've wronged him is a way of not letting their actions control him, and that it's a decision that he makes daily.
If you got your car stuck after taking a wrong turn into a forest at night, and the only house nearby looked really creepy, would you knock on the door and ask for help? Or sleep in your car and search for help the next day on foot? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.